There is a voice inside your mind right now. It comments on your decisions, it analyzes situations, it remembers the past, it plans the future. Most people believe that voice is who they are, but there is something strange about that idea. Because if you observe carefully, you begin to notice that something is listening to that voice. And in this video, we are going to explore a discovery that is simple, yet deeply liberating. You are not the voice inside your head. And when that understanding stops being just an idea and becomes an experience, something changes completely. The mind keeps thinking, but you are no longer trapped inside it. From a very early age, without anyone needing to explain it to us directly, we begin to identify with the voice that exists inside the mind. That voice comments on what is happening, interprets situations, judges choices, revisits the past, and anticipates scenarios that have not even arrived yet. It feels so intimate, so constant, so present, that we end up assuming it is who we really are. When it says, "I need to do this," it feels like we are the ones speaking. When it says, "I failed," it feels like we are the ones suffering. When it brings back a painful memory or imagines a threatening future, the whole body reacts as if that narrative were reality itself. Little by little, without noticing, that voice becomes the center of our identity. We do not just listen to the mind, we begin to live from it. And perhaps that is exactly where one of the deepest illusions of human experience begins. What is most striking is that this voice does not comment only on the big moments of life. It comments on everything. It is there when you look at someone and immediately form an opinion. It is there when you replay a conversation and imagine what you should have said. It is there when you compare yourself, when you blame yourself, when you defend yourself, when you worry. The mind behaves like an endless narrator of reality, trying to give name, shape, and meaning to everything that happens. And because that narration is continuous, we often confuse its presence with our own essence. It feels natural to think that we are this mental stream. After all, it is always there. It knows our history. It knows our fears. It knows our desires. But the fact that something is always present in experience does not necessarily mean that it is who we are at the deepest level. There is also an emotional reason for this confusion. The voice of the mind does not just narrate reality. It builds a version of who we believe we are. It repeats stories about our identity, reinforces old wounds, projects fears into the future, and tries to keep the image we have of ourselves coherent. In other words, it sustains the psychological character we identify with, and that creates a powerful sense of continuity. It feels as if there is a solid eye being maintained by that inner voice all the time. But if we look more honestly, we begin to notice that the voice is constantly changing. Sometimes it is confident. Sometimes it is cruel. Sometimes it is gentle. Sometimes it is anxious. Sometimes it sounds like our parents. Sometimes like our fears. Sometimes like our wounds. And that raises a silent question that almost no one asks. If this voice changes so much, why are we so certain that it is who we are? Perhaps the most important point is this. The mind does not only think, it interprets. It takes the raw experience of life and immediately turns it into narrative. It tells you what something means. It tells you what that event says about you. It tells you whether it is threat or safety, success or failure, love or rejection. And we do this so automatically that we rarely notice the power this narration has over our daily experience. Maybe that is why questioning the mind touches something so deep in us. Because when we begin to investigate this voice, we also begin to investigate who we really are behind it. And that is exactly why this channel exists. To explore in depth the questions that usually go unnoticed in the rush of life. So if this kind of investigation resonates with you, subscribe to the channel, because what comes next makes everything even stranger. If the voice in your head feels so intimate, so constant, and so personal, why does it arise on its own without asking your permission? And if you do not choose the thoughts that appear, how could they possibly be who you really are? If you observe your own mind sincerely for a few moments, you will notice something very strange. Thoughts simply appear. They do not ask permission. They do not announce their arrival. They do not wait for your approval. One thought appears, then another, And almost always we enter that movement automatically, as if we were being carried by an invisible current. You may be sitting in silence, looking out a window, and suddenly a memory appears. You may be trying to rest, and without warning, the mind begins to imagine a problem, replay a conversation, or create a future scenario that does not even exist. All of this happens without conscious effort, and this is exactly where a decisive question begins to emerge. If thoughts appear on their own, how can we be so certain that they are what we really are? This point is deeper than it seems, because we spend our entire lives assuming that the mind is under our control. Yet a few minutes of honest silence are enough to show that this is not true in the way we imagined. Try right now to choose with total precision what your next thought will be. Do not try to control the general topic. Try to choose the exact sentence, image, or memory that will arise next. You will notice something unsettling. The thought appears, but not as an object consciously manufactured by you. It simply emerges. Sometimes it comes as a word, sometimes as an image, sometimes as a sensation. It comes out of nowhere, remains for a moment, and then disappears, giving way to another. And if that is true, then we are no longer talking only about the mind as a narrator. We are beginning to see that the mind may be far more of a spontaneous flow than a solid identity. As this observation deepens, something begins to loosen inside. Because most psychological suffering is born precisely from automatic identification with thoughts. A thought of fear appears, and immediately we become fear. A thought of guilt appears, and immediately we become guilt. A thought of inadequacy appears, and suddenly all of our energy begins to obey that narrative. But if the thought arose on its own, if it was not consciously created by you, then there is a distance between what appears in the mind and what you really are. At first, that distance is subtle, but it is also deeply liberating, because it reveals that perhaps you are not the mental content moving through your awareness. Perhaps you are something quieter, something more stable, something deeper than any thought that comes and goes. And this is exactly where the investigation begins to touch a more spiritual dimension of experience. Because when you realize that thoughts arise on their own, something inside you begins to ask a different question. Then who is seeing all of this happen? Who is aware of the birth and disappearance of each thought? Who remains present while the mind changes subject, mood, story, and direction? That question changes the investigation completely. We are no longer trying to organize thoughts more effectively. We are trying to notice what exists before thoughts, during thoughts, and after thoughts. And when that question truly opens, we enter a territory much deeper than ordinary psychology. Because perhaps behind the moving mind, there is a presence that has never moved at all. And that question reveals something even deeper. Because if thoughts appear and disappear, and yet something in you remains present to notice all of it, then perhaps the most important thing is not the thought. Perhaps it is that which is observing the thought. And when we begin to look more closely at that observer, we discover something silent, yet absolutely transformative. When we begin to notice that thoughts arise on their own, a new possibility appears before us. Perhaps there is something in us that is not the thought, but that which perceives the thought. Something silent, subtle, almost always overlooked, because the mind speaks too loudly for its presence to be easily noticed. This observer does not comment, it does not argue, it does not try to convince. It simply perceives. It perceives when a thought is born. It perceives when an emotion moves through the body. It perceives when the mind becomes agitated, when it grows quiet, when it imagines, when it fears, when it remembers. And the most important detail is this. It remains present through all of those changes. Thoughts change. Emotional states change. Mental narratives change. But something remains silently there, as if it were the constant background of the whole experience. At first, this idea may seem abstract, because we are used to giving attention only to the movement of the mind, not to the presence that witnesses that movement. But if you observe honestly, you will notice that this observer is not a theory. It is present right now. Something in you is aware of these words as they are being read. Something is aware of the reactions that arise, the interest, the doubt, perhaps even the resistance. That something does not need to make an effort to exist. It is already here. Before the next thought arrives, it is already present. After the thought passes, it remains present. And this realization shifts the axis of the whole investigation, because for the first time, we begin to suspect that identity may not be in what passes through the mind, but in what remains conscious while everything passes. There's something deeply liberating about this discovery, but also something unsettling. Because becoming aware of the silent observer means beginning to loosen the old identity. It means recognizing that perhaps you have spent your whole life confusing your essence with an unstable mental flow. And that changes everything. It changes the way you understand fear, guilt, anxiety, comparison, and attachment to your own story. After all, if there is an observer in you that remains untouched while thoughts change, then perhaps you are not as trapped in the mind as you always believed. Perhaps the mind is only one layer of experience, not the absolute center of what you are. This possibility does not destroy thought, nor does it turn the mind into an enemy. It simply returns each thing to its proper place. The mind thinks, the observer perceives, and when that distinction begins to grow clear, something opens. Not only a philosophical idea, but a wider experience of yourself, because the silent observer does not feel small. It does not feel fragmented. It does not feel made of sentences, memories, or mental images. It has a more spacious quality, a more stable quality, a deeper quality. And that is exactly why so many spiritual traditions have always pointed in this direction. Not to worship thought, but to move beyond it. Not to reinforce the mind's narrative, but to reveal what remains when the mind can no longer define who we are. And when we reach this point in the investigation, the question stops being merely psychological. It becomes spiritual. And this discovery opens the door to a much deeper dimension of consciousness. Because if there is in you a silent observer, that is not the thought. That is not the narrative. That is not the voice inside the mind. Then what exactly is it? And when that question is carried all the way to the end, we begin to touch something that entire spiritual traditions have tried to name for centuries. Perhaps what observes the mind is closer to your true essence than any thought that has ever passed through it. When the investigation reaches this point, something begins to change in nature. We are no longer only talking about thoughts, nor merely observing the workings of the mind. We are standing before a much more intimate and much older question. If you are not the voice inside your head, if you are not the stream of thoughts that appears and disappears without your control, then what exactly are you? The question seems simple, but it touches the center of human existence, because nearly our entire life has been built upon an identification with the mental narrative, with the personal story, with the fears, desires, memories, and images the mind endlessly repeats. But when that identification begins to loosen, even for a moment, something quieter begins to be noticed. Something that does not need words in order to exist. Something that does not depend on thoughts in order to know that it is here. In many spiritual traditions, this point has always been regarded as sacred, not because there is something religious about it in a dogmatic sense, but because it points toward what exists before any mental construction, before the name, before the story, before the opinions you hold about yourself, before the psychological character you learn to present to the world. Thoughts change, roles change, life stages change, but there is a presence that moves through all of it. The same presence that was there in your childhood, even though the mind of that child was completely different from the mind you have now. The same presence that is still here now, while new thoughts arise and old ones disappear. When we look deeply into this presence, we begin to notice that it does not have the shape of the mind. It does not speak. It does not defend itself. It does not justify itself. It simply is. Perhaps that is exactly why so many contemplative traditions describe the essence of being not as an elevated thought, but as pure awareness, a silent field of presence within which the whole of experience takes place. Thoughts arise within it. Emotions arise within it. Sensations arise within it. Even the sense of I arises within it. And yet the field itself remains untouched. It does not age in the same way the body ages. It does not fragment in the same way the mind fragments. It does not suffer in the same way the ego suffers when its narrative is threatened. That does not mean pain magically disappears, nor that life stops being human. It simply means that there is something in you deeper than what suffers, vaster than what fears, quieter than what thinks, and touching that, even for a few seconds, already begins to change the way you live. Because when you realize that perhaps you are not the voice inside the head, another possibility opens. The possibility that your true identity is not trapped in the mind. The possibility that you are not merely the narrator of experience, but the living space within which all experience appears. And that changes everything. It changes your relationship to thoughts, because they stop being commands and become passive movements. It changes your relationship to fear, because fear stops being a definition of what you are and becomes just a cloud moving through awareness. It changes your relationship to suffering, because even in the middle of pain, something in you remains present, deeper than the pain itself. And perhaps that is the real spiritual turning point. Not believing in a new idea, but directly recognizing what has always been there, quiet, waiting to be seen. Not as theory, not as concept, but as the living reality of what you are. And when this perception begins to mature, even in a very subtle way, something becomes impossible to ignore. Perhaps you were never the voice inside your head. Perhaps the voice is simply something that appears within you, just as thoughts appear, just as emotions appear, just as the whole narrative of your life appears. And if that is true, then the final question of this video stops being merely philosophical. It becomes deeply personal. Who are you? When the mind grows quiet, if this video awakens something in you, tell me in the comments. Have you ever noticed, even for a brief moment, that there is something in you beyond the mind? I would really love to read your experience. And if you enjoy this kind of investigation into consciousness, reality, and the deeper nature of being, subscribe to the channel. Because in the next video, we are going to explore a question that takes this discovery even further. If you are not the voice inside your head, then who is truly experiencing reality? I will see you in the next video.